The summit meetings of 1959 to 1961. So far, our study of the Cold War has been one of continually deteriorating relations between the Americans and the West, and the Soviet Union and the East. In today's lessons, we will look at the meetings that were arranged between the leaders of both sides in order to try and, at the very least, stop relations getting even worse, and hopefully, possibly, make them even better. But in doing so, we will see that the Cold War isn't just about a struggle between the East and the West, between communism and capitalism, between democracy and dictatorship. We will also see that it is a struggle between personalities. The need for leaders to look strong and in command, and how both leaders on both sides postured and behaved in a way that made them look appealing to their own people. So there's a human dimension to the Cold War that we're now going to take a look at today. Firstly, however, what we will do is, as per all our lessons, is we will start with a recall. So let's go through some of the prior learning that you've undertaken. This is going to be a Who Am I activity. Anyone that you are not familiar with, I want you to pause and make notes about them, and then record that, possibly staple it to the relevant section of your booklet. So firstly, who am I? The Marshall Plan was named after me. This would be George C. Marshall. He was the American Secretary of State who went to Europe in the winter of 1946-47 and saw that Europe was in a terrible state, and convinced President Truman that money needed to be poured into Europe in order to stop the spread of communism. People with poverty and no hope would probably, in the American opinion, be more tempted by communism. So he gave his name to the Marshall Plan. I was the British Prime Minister and negotiator at the final conference held at Potsdam, and that would be Clement Attlee. Who am I? I was the Soviet leader at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, and that would be Joseph Stalin. I succeeded Stalin. This will be Nikita Khrushchev, who will play a part in the lesson that we're going to do today. My doctrine said that the Soviet Union should be contained. This is President Truman, who, unlike his predecessor Roosevelt, had no love of Stalin, and the mistrust between Truman and Stalin led to increasingly poor relations between the East and the West. I wrote the long telegram that said the Soviet Union must be regarded as a rival and hostile to the Soviet Union, to the United States, and that would be George Kennan. I argued that the Soviet Union was trying to dominate the world, and my telegram did much to harden Stalin's attitudes towards the United States, and that would be Nikolai Novikov, the Soviet ambassador to the United States. Who am I? I replaced Rákosi as the leader of Hungary after the death of Stalin and started to bring about reforms. I am Imre Nagy, and he would die, consequently, for his part in the Hungarian Revolution. Who am I? I became the new leader of Hungary once the Hungarian uprising had been dealt with and crushed. I'm János Kedar. I gave a speech in which I mentioned an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. I am Winston Churchill. So, back to our story of the Cold War. A Europe divided, split along a line called by Churchill the Iron Curtain. Capitalist democracies to the west, communist dictatorships to the east, both sides armed with a worrying array of nuclear weapons pointed at each other, the use of which would result in mutually assured destruction. More detail is that the city of Berlin, within East Germany, is divided into 4 zones of occupation, with the British, French, and American zones being collectively known as West Berlin. Stalin had already tried to deal with the problem of West Berlin in 1948 by blockading the city in order to drive the Western Allies out. But of course, in doing so, they would look weak, and therefore they resolved to stay, and they used the Berlin airlift to supply the city, which eventually resulted in Stalin backing down. Despite that, West Berlin still remains a problem for Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, and so does West Germany. Both these countries, capitalist democracies supported by American weapons and American money through the Marshall Plan, have both recovered remarkably quickly. West Germany experienced what was known as an economic miracle, reconstructing Germany so fast that the German economy by 1960 was bigger than it had been before World War II. Therefore, West Germany was a serious problem for Khrushchev. Before 1961, Khrushchev had tried to persuade the Allies to leave West Berlin voluntarily. He was not going to use the same tactics as Stalin had done. But Khrushchev in particular had a refugee problem with West Berlin. Between 1949 and 1961, about 4 million East Germans fled, or to use the Cold War term, defected to the West. West Germany didn't recognize East Germany's existence, and it recognized all Germans as citizens of West Germany. All the East Germans had to do was to get to West Germany, and they would be housed, clothed, fed, given a job. East Germans only had to walk through to East Berlin, from East Berlin to West Berlin, take a plane, and fly to West Germany. Simple as that. 4 million of them did it. The entire maths department of Leipzig University in East Germany defected in one day. The key thing here is not only was East Germany losing 4 million people, it was losing the brightest and the best and the young, those with the greatest instinct to leave. Not only was Khrushchev losing valuable people, the refugee problem was also very embarrassing. If communism was meant to be perfect, if communism was meant to be a better system, a utopia, why were people leaving it? This lesson focuses on Khrushchev's attempts to force the West out, which became known as the Berlin Crisis, effectively an extension of the Berlin Crisis of 1948. President Eisenhower then, America's president from 1953 through until 1960. His attitude towards West Berlin was somewhat different from President Truman, his predecessor. There must be some way to develop some kind of free city that might be part of West Germany. Perhaps the United Nations would guarantee the freedom, the safety, and the security of the city. The time is coming, and perhaps soon, when we could simply have to get our forces out. Eisenhower is a military man. He was a senior commander of the Allies during World War II. And looking at the problem of West Berlin, he knows that West Berlin is militarily undefendable. Therefore, he has a rather practical approach to it. Does his comment make war more or less likely? Well, the answer would be seemingly less likely. He's wishing to defuse the crisis over West Berlin. Khrushchev, in a way that he was known to be, rather frankly spoken and coarse in his language. You fascist bastards are the kind we did not finish off at Stalingrad. We hit you so hard that we put you 10 feet under right away. If you boo us and attack us again, look out. We will hit you so hard there won't be a squeal out of you. Khrushchev is certainly speaking like a man who's prepared to fight a war. President Kennedy, who succeeds Eisenhower in 1960. We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin, either gradually or by force. There is peace in Berlin today. The source of trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. We seek peace, but we shall not surrender. Kennedy speaking in far more black and white terms than his predecessor Eisenhower had. Kennedy was not prepared to pull out of Berlin for reasons that we will explore later in the course. If your troops try and force their way to Berlin, we will oppose them by force. War is bound to go thermonuclear, and though you and I may survive, all your European allies will be completely destroyed. from a conversation between a US diplomat and Khrushchev in 1961. Clearly, Berlin remains the centre of the Cold War. What you're going to do for me now is complete the task that's illustrated here. The y-axis of the graph is the likelihood of war breaking out, and the x-axis is the year. Berlin is the focus. You need to place the statements on the next page on that graph, interpreting them to determine how likely the chances of war breaking out are. 10 being high, 1 being low. For each of them, what was the impact of each event? Did it make war more or less likely? Then write definitions, please, of the following events: Khrushchev's 1958 Berlin Ultimatum, the 1960 Paris Summit, and the 1961 Vienna Summit. The second extension question: how close was the world to nuclear war by 1961? So those are the statements that you need to plot onto that graph. Then they need to be annotated with explanations, and then you can use the PowerPoint to determine how accurately you have plotted your graph. The PowerPoint will then go on to go through follow-up work on knowledge retrieval and essay writing skills.